83 degrees this Thursday in Phoenix. And as the Lord would have it, the day runs long, ready or not. Working until about 5 last night. The wake-up call was about 1 this afternoon. That's weird. Sometimes we get out of whack. It's out of whack. So as we woke up, we got a nice little HOA letter, so we had to be out in our garden most of the day, pulling weeds and cleaning up, pretty much to immaculate perfection. And so now we are ready to do Cafe Jesus Daily Word. May the Lord bless this time together, you and us, and may He inspire us, grow us, and speak to us in our everyday life, in our everyday chores, and these everyday examples to us from King David, and today in particular with Absalom, chapter 18. And here we go, today's reading.
Then David mustered the men who were with him, and set over them commanders of thousands, and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule. The mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, What, you saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, For my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there was nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand, and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, every one to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. Then Ahimaaz the son of Zadok said, Let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. And Joab said to him, You are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Then Ahimaaz the son of Zadok said again to Joab, Come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. And Joab said, Why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and outran the Cushite. Now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, "See, another man running alone." The king said, "He also brings news." The watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "All is well." And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." And the king was deeply moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son."
Don't think the punishment of David for his lifetime of sins and errors was fierce? It was. So, as we get to the beginning of the chapter again, David put out 3 captains because Absalom was in pursuit to kill David and take the kingdom, usurp the kingdom. So Joab and Abishai and Ittai the Gittite was familiar with the layout. David knew the commander and belonged out in the battle. He did not want to repeat his previous mistake and not go to battle as he should have, like he did when he was watching Bathsheba and Joab was doing the fighting. "You shall not go out," the people told him. Says the people surrounding David would not let him go to battle with the rest of the army. There were 3 reasons they insisted on this. 1, his life was worth a lot more. They could win the war, but if they didn't have David, David was the king still. So he was worth 10,000. And he could bring reserves if they were faltering in the war. He could bring more help. And they understood it would be very hard for David to take down his own son. So David was not stubborn. He always would submit to the good advice of others. He did not give up his leadership. In doing so, he practiced good leadership by listening to the wise advice of the people around him. Now, David wanted to make it known that Absalom was to be captured alive and not mistreated in any way. This would put greater pressure on the captains, but was also a precursor that David would do nothing once Absalom was returned to the kingdom. And do you think Absalom would repay such kindness? No, he would have grown even more bitter and would have figured out another plot, like Saul did, to throw a spear or a javelin at David and kill him. So, those loyal to David fought versus Israel, a house now divided, Israel fighting Israel, because Israel was not loyal to David. Israel was seduced by Absalom's charisma and power, just like they were to Saul when they didn't want to follow God. David had arranged the battle to take place in the terrain in the forest because he knew that the experience and courage of each individual soldier was much more power than the sheer numbers of inexperienced people fighting on the other side. A man was worth his salt in David's army. So God fought for David also in unusual ways. Soldiers loyal to Absalom seemed to be swallowed up in the woods. They were not used to being out in the forest. The Chaldee, Syriac, and Arabic documents state that they were devoured by wild beasts. So God did help David again. Absalom's vanity put him in this battle, remember, against the wise counsel of Ahithophel. Absalom didn't seem like a great general, but he's riding into the battle on a mule, not a horse, and with his good looks, of course, his luxurious hair, like a politician. What was then his glory is now his curse. Absalom was caught in the thicket of a tree in the forest, and the donkey deserted him, and here he was left hanging over a cliff with his hair clinging to the tree. When this was reported to Joab, the general wondered why the men did not immediately kill him. The man, this is your enemy. This is why we're fighting. The man replied that he would not do so out of obedience and faithfulness to David. Joab insisted he would have given both money and promotion to the one who killed Absalom. I would have given you 10 shekels and a silver belt. Yet the men would not do it out of loyalty to David. In fact, they said even 10,000 coins of silver, or 1,000, would not have been suffice in their hands. This is the military belt, though, was a chief ornament of a soldier, and it was a highly prized in the ancient of nations. It is also a rich present from one chieftain to another. Joab did not hesitate to strike Absalom. He knew that his commander David told him not to do so, but Joab was convinced in the best interest of Israel and all the people that Absalom needed justice, not mercy anymore. Absalom only received what he deserved. He was a murderer, a traitor, and a rapist. Funny how he defended his sister from being raped and yet became a rapist 10 times worse than his father or his brother Amnon. Joab knew that David was generally indulgent toward his children, never punishing them. We might say that Joab was correct, but he was not right. He was correct in understanding that it was better for David and for Israel that Absalom be dead. He was not right in disobeying the king, the God-appointed authority over him. Joab's act was disloyal and a cowardly murder. And notice the 3 spears in the side. It's almost like a typology of Jesus here. The son, spears in the side, and David at the end wanting to take his place. You can see Jesus in every chapter of the Bible, I'll tell you. Joab would be accountable for what he did to Absalom. Both God and David eventually would make sure of this. 1 Kings chapter 2. The 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom, struck him, and beat him till if he wasn't dead from the spears, they made sure of it. Because the heart's kind of like when he says they struck him in the middle, he probably got him in the stomach and other places, but not specifically in the heart, so he was still alive. As he defiled his father's 10 concubines, these 10 youngsters made sure that he had little breath as it was beaten out of his body. And they took and cast Absalom into a large pit into the cliff and laid a heap of stones over him. Joab wanted to make sure this is an example for all those who wish to be rebels, and they are not to be memorialized or remembered as great men or honor. All Israel then fled when they saw what happened. Everyone to his tent. Absalom's army was in full retreat. David's forces completely carried the day. However, before Absalom died, he did make a memorial for himself, a pillar. He said, well, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he did have 3 sons. 2 Samuel.14 tells us this, but we can surmise that they all died before their father did. Now the 2 runners were sent to tell the outcome of the battle to David. Really, it was just one, but one could outrun the other, so it became 2. And David learns of Absalom's death from the Cushite, who arrives after Ahaz. And David mourns greatly. The Hebrew idea implies that there was a violent trembling in his body. And I don't know if you've ever sinned, and afterward the Holy Spirit's come upon you and convicted you, and you were trembling. You knew whatever sin you did was a big sin, and you were in big trouble if it wasn't repented of and asked for forgiveness and cleansing, because God deals with his children. He doesn't wink or look the other way at sin. He wants you to be in line. David felt completely undone at the hearing of Absalom's death. In fact, he kept mourning. David saw his sins and his weakness and his rebellion was exaggerated in Absalom. sins of the father repeated in the children, sometimes a lot worse. And the father recognized how much he was responsible for the son, but yet he never corrected his sons or daughters. 19 and 1, and it would have been 21 had the firstborn of Bathsheba and he did not die. It is as though he said, "He is indeed my son. His weaknesses are my weaknesses. His passions are my passions. His sins are my sins." David wanted to die in the place of his rebellious son, just as Jesus did for us. What David could not do, God did in dying for the place of rebellious sinners. So we see the heart of David here. His cry was to actually hear the cry of God for his lost children. His desire was to restore it, and his desire was to forgive. Well, that was quite a chapter. Doesn't get any better. We do get to the last three parts of the chapter, 21 through 24, perhaps a weekend or next week, where it's kind of like a reflection of prose and poetry, but doesn't get any better in chapter 19 or 20. So stay tuned. Should the Lord tarry, we have more for you tomorrow, but if not, I'm looking for you on the other end. Thanks for joining us today. Have a wonderful day in the Lord. Share Jesus.